Armed guards patrol the frozen shores of a remote Russian island with dogs and rifles, scanning the freezing waters that surround their fortress like a moat. Motion sensors track every movement. Spotlights sweep the darkness at night, searching for any sign of the impossible. Someone trying to flee Russia's most inescapable prison. Welcome to Pyatak, Russia's Alcatraz. Here you'll find 180 of the country's worst killers who spend 22.5 hours a day locked in stone cells. Serial killers, terrorists, even convicted cannibals all call this island home while serving life sentences. They will all die there, and they know it. Now, what makes this place so unique is not just its perfect record of containment. It's that these thick stone walls, they've witnessed over a century of suffering. Built back in 1517 as a monastery for prayer and the seclusion of Russian Orthodox monks, it was violently transformed by Stalin into a killing ground for political prisoners and now serves as a holding ground for some of Russia's worst criminals. I imagine the monks would be best pleased. But what is life really like when you're counting the decades in near total isolation on an island of the damned? Well, let's find out. Alright, so the island's fateful history, like we said, dates back to 1517 when a Russian Orthodox monk named Cyril of Novozersk first discovered the place. Legend has it that Cyril saw a column of fire strike the otherwise unremarkable patch of land and took it as a sign from God. I imagine I would call that a random lightning strike. Now, from there he established a monastery and he named it Ognenny Ostrov, or Fire Island, in memory of that supposed divine intervention / lightning strike. This is no comfortable retreat location, far from it. The climate is incredibly harsh. Winters can bring temperatures that drop to -30 Celsius. It's really bloody cold, that's what it is. It's got strong winds sweeping across the frozen lake that can kill in minutes. Keeping warm during the cold season is a daily struggle, and it's a risk to one's life. Summer doesn't really offer much relief. Temperatures swing just as dramatically in the other direction, reaching as high as 30 degrees Celsius, coupled with high humidity that makes physical activity exhausting. And then there are the mosquitoes. Swarms of mosquitoes. Swarms that are thick enough to drive a man to madness if left exposed. By the start of the 20th century, this monastery had become something of a thriving, if remote, religious center. Nearly 100 monks lived within its walls, busying themselves, copying manuscripts, tending to their gardens when the weather allowed, and maintaining the daily rhythms of prayer that had been a part of life for centuries. After a devastating fire swept through the monastery in 1906, leaving little standing, it took about a decade to get the island back up and running. The rebuilt complex was much more solidly constructed than the previous series of construction projects, which had been repeatedly added to over the centuries. The new stone buildings, they were meant to last for even more centuries. But then came 1917, and with it the October Revolution that rather changed the course of Russian history as well as world history forever. The Bolsheviks, they did not stop at toppling the Tsar and his imperial government. They declared war on religion itself. Churches across Russia were shattered, priests were arrested, and religious artifacts were destroyed in the name of building a godless workers' paradise. The remote monastery, despite its isolation, wasn't immune to this upheaval. In 1919, Soviet forces arrived at Fire Island with orders to transform the location forever. To the Bolsheviks, this monastery represented the old religious order that had to be eliminated. However, its isolated location and fortress-like construction made it actually pretty perfect for their purposes. Their eviction was brutal and swift. Soviet soldiers stripped the monks of their robes and expelled them into the surrounding wilderness, desecrating centuries-old relics and religious artifacts in the process. Local legend claims that as the last abbot was forced onto a boat, he cursed the soldiers and prophesied that the island would become a place of great suffering. After this process was complete, the Bolsheviks found themselves in possession of a compound that was constructed almost like a fortress, complete with thick, tall walls and in total isolation. It didn't take them very long to develop ideas about how they could retrofit this monastery into something more useful to the needs of Moscow. This retrofitting would, of course, involve transforming the island into a prison camp. It didn't require that much work. Monks lived simply, and it was relatively easy to convert their rooms into cells. The smaller of the two chapels became an administrative office, its altars replaced with filing cabinets and Soviet bureaucratic machinery. Another form of religion, we suppose. Now, by the 1930s, the prison was designated Novozersky ITK-14, or Corrective Labor Colony Number 14. It played a significant role during the height of Stalin's Great Terror, although its relatively small size prevented it from becoming as famous as some of the more massive labor camps that would characterize the gulag system during this period of history. Now, many of the earliest prisoners here were priests and bishops who had refused to renounce their faith. They found themselves imprisoned in what had been a holy site just months earlier, sleeping in the same rooms where monks had once prayed. Lest they forget what this place had become, though, the boards on the windows and the thick locks on the doors served as stark reminders. And that's not even discussing what the guards had in store for them. They were quickly joined by political prisoners accused of counter-revolutionary activities, a charge that became increasingly common during Stalin's reign of terror. What was followed was a systematic campaign of brutality that would define Pyatak for decades to come. Conditions were devastating, made worse by the treatment from guards who seemed to relish their work. The scattered archival records that survived this period hint at widespread torture and arbitrary executions, although the full extent of this brutality has been buried with the victims. What little we do know is staggering, though. Prisoners were forced to work day in and day out regardless of the weather. Given the brutal winter conditions and the poor clothing protection provided to inmates, many simply died of exposure. Those who survived, they often lost toes, fingers, or entire limbs to frostbite, and medical care inside the prison wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. Probably wasn't even a thing. Others simply vanished after interrogation sessions, never to be heard or seen again. Well, Stalin's death in 1953, it marked the end of an era at Pyatak. Almost immediately, the political camp was officially dissolved along with the rest of the gulag system under his successor Nikita Khrushchev's reforms and transformed into a high-security prison for criminal offenders. The political prisoners already there were either transferred elsewhere gradually, or if their crimes were deemed minor enough, they were just released. Torture and arbitrary executions, which had become a hallmark of the Stalin years, ceased, officially. In reality, there were still isolated cases, but it was a dramatic change nonetheless. For the first time in decades, prisoners could expect to survive their sentences. By 1962, the facility had been officially renamed Corrective Labor Colony Number 5, cementing the Pyatak nickname derived from the Russian word for the number 5. Details about daily life throughout these decades remain pretty scarce, buried in Soviet-era records that probably will just never see the light of day. What we do know is that the prison continued to exploit its natural fortress-like qualities to make escape just impossible, housing some of the Soviet Union's most dangerous criminals, many of whom would be sentenced to death and executed within its walls. The monasteries suffering under Stalin had proven one crucial thing. These ancient walls could contain anyone securely and away from prying eyes. So when post-Soviet Russia faced new challenges, they knew where to look. As the old communist world collapsed and the new Russia underwent something of an identity crisis under Boris Yeltsin, a moratorium on capital punishment was implemented in 1994. This moratorium was initially intended to be temporary, but Russia never followed through on resuming executions. It has been indefinitely extended by the Constitutional Court and remains in place to this day. Those who have been previously sentenced to death were now lifers, a term for those who knew they would never get out of prison and they'd die there of old age. Given this new class of prisoner, Russia needed somewhere to put their worst offenders. They knew these inmates would be there for a long time and couldn't risk them escaping. Once again, Pyatak offered the perfect solution. The only access is a 400-meter causeway. Beyond the lake stretch miles of marshland that would trap any escapee who somehow managed to make it across the water. Today, reaching Pyatak is a journey that almost takes you back in time. The nearest city, Belozersk, lies 35 kilometers away, with only one road connecting it, a road that turns to dirt as you approach the lake. The landscape becomes increasingly desolate the closer you get, with only a small, run-down village on the mainland across from the prison. This is where most of the guards live. It's not exactly fancy, but at least they don't have a horrible commute. The first lifers here were a mix of the worst criminals from all across Russia. They arrived at Pyatak in the spring of 1994, 17 men transferred from death row. Among them was Sergei Golovkin, who had raped and murdered 11 boys in the Moscow region between 1986 and 1992. The lake itself serves as Pyatak's most effective barrier. In summer, despite the heat, the lake's water rarely exceeds 20 degrees Celsius and is often in the low teens. This temperature is cold enough to give someone hypothermia in minutes. In winter, the weather becomes so cold that the entire body of water freezes over. While this does provide some form of a land bridge, the deadly cold would make it a quick killer, even if escapees were able to make it off the lake. This isolation serves as a powerful deterrent. Even if you could escape the prison, you'd almost certainly die in the attempt. To date, there has never been a successful escape from the prison, but that's not to say people haven't tried. Officially, there's only been one recorded attempt. In 1992, Alexander Petrov thought he could hide himself in the trash, and it nearly worked. He had successfully made it inside the garbage truck before guards caught him just before the vehicle left the causeway. Now, every single vehicle is searched both manually and with high-tech equipment that can even scan for heartbeats, a result of the paranoia that his escape attempt caused. For outside observers, this might sound a little bit extreme, but for prison guards, it makes perfect sense. These men are locked away for life with little hope of ever getting out. Russian law technically does allow lifers to petition for parole after 25 years if they have a perfect conduct record for at least the last 3 of those years. But success in this process is almost non-existent for those with crimes severe enough to end up in Pyatak. By 2017, 192 maximum security convicts have been eligible to apply for parole. Of the 49 who actually filed petitions, not a single one was approved. In this world, the very conditions the prison impose on them become arguments against their release. The isolation, lack of social skills, and various other side effects demonstrate how they couldn't survive alone outside again, especially those who have no family, or at least none willing to take them in. The human mind is not meant to be idle day in and day out. If you don't give it something to pursue, it's going to find something. The Deputy Warden Mikhail Volkov agrees, quote, "We must assume they're always planning. The day we become complacent is the day someone dies." End quote. Now, the constant threat of escape planning wasn't the only challenge facing prison officials. Remember, the buildings the prison operated in were built back in 1916 after the fire, and it showed, both from age and deterioration. For decades, prisoners had languished in awful conditions that took a toll on their physical well-being, sometimes lethally. For starters, running water wasn't standard here. Prisoners had to relieve themselves in buckets that would then sit in the corner of their cells for hours. The heating system was functional, but far from ideal during the cold winters, especially given the stone cells that they lived in. Even the electrical systems were a patchwork of Soviet-era wiring that had gradually been added to over the years. These decrepit conditions created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Tuberculosis rates were always high here, but would occasionally soar as high as 50% among inmates, a staggering statistic considering that well under 1% of Russia's general population contracts the disease. In these cramped, poorly ventilated stone cells where human waste festers in buckets, deadly bacteria absolutely thrive. It was clear that the prison needed renovations, and in 2011 they finally got them. These improvements dramatically increased the quality of life for inmates and transformed the conditions into something much more modern. The installation of running water and flushing toilets eliminated the absurd bucket system that had defined prison life for generations. The smell of human waste that had soaked into the stone walls finally began to dissipate. New heating systems dramatically improved the temperatures inside the cells during the winter months. These improvements also brought equally comprehensive upgrades to the prison system's security. Cell doors were reinforced with modern steel security cameras, which for years had fed grainy images from Soviet-era cameras to picture tube TVs, were replaced with HD cameras. The monastery's infrastructure, built to last centuries, proved that it could stand the test of time, despite serving a very different purpose than it had been originally designed for. But renovations can only change so much. Behind those reinforced steel doors and under the watch of cameras, 180 men still wake up every morning to the same brutal reality. They will spend the rest of their lives in this place. What exactly does that life entail? Well, understanding what life is like inside Pyatak requires recognizing just how different it is from the average Russian jail. The country operates 4 types of facilities: pre-trial institutions, juvenile colonies, corrective colonies, and special regime prisons. The vast majority of prisoners in Russia fall into the corrective colonies category. Pyatak is one of 7 so-called special regime colonies designed for lifers across Russia. Unlike regular prisons where inmates serve sentences of varying lengths, the men here are all facing life sentences. The prison's currently home to roughly 180 men, plus the guards who live on the other side of the causeway in what has become a small village. Unlike normal prisons, The place wasn't built to be uniform. It was repurposed during the Bolshevik Revolution, and officials made do with rooms that were available. This arrangement has persisted to this day. Walking the corridors inside the prison isn't an otherworldly experience. You can immediately tell that this is a prison housed within what used to be a monastery. Arched doorways, religious carvings, and relics on the walls all tell the story of the pre-Soviet days. These former spaces of prayer now contain steel bunk beds bolted to the floor, small tables, and a limited selection of personal possessions that make up each man's entire world. Some cells converted from monastic chambers are unusually large, up to 40 square meters, 10 times the standard cell size. Cell 47, which once housed the monastery's library, now holds 3 lifers, including Artem Andreev, one of the academy maniacs who killed 6 people, just for the fun of it. Most cells throughout the prison hold 2 to 4 men, though some inmates are held in isolation for security purposes. Alexander Bychov, who was convicted for the murder and cannibalization of 9 men between 2009 and 2012, lives in his own cell. Other inmates simply refuse to share with him. And what can we say? Can't exactly blame them. Closer examination might lead to some surprising discoveries, especially for a maximum security Russian prison. Radios, cassette players, and even TVs and games consoles are brought by relatives. They're not exactly cutting edge, mostly an old PlayStation 2 or Xbox 360, but it's not what one might expect in such a place. Yuri Chikatilo spends his time playing Grand Theft Auto, and the irony is not lost on anybody. Quote, "I'm playing a criminal in a game while being a criminal in a cage," he said in an interview. Nevertheless, these items offer an escape from the never-ending boredom that 22.5 hours a day in a cell will bring. The lenience approach, and we emphasize the comparative nature of that statement, developed in the mid-1990s under Colonel Vladimir Onuschenko, their first post-Soviet warden. He believed these lifers spared execution deserved some means of maintaining their humanity. He told his staff, "We're not here to torture them. Time is torture enough." At Pyatak, guards do handcuff prisoners while moving them, a normal prison practice, but they can walk upright, look forward, and generally maintain more of their dignity. What captures the attention of many transfers here isn't just that beatings aren't used as punishment, but rather the absence of the random beatings that characterize so many other prisons and made conditions so unbearable. You're damned if you did, and damned if you didn't. It's this relative comfort that sets modern-day Pyatak apart from Russia's other supermax facilities. At the infamous Black Dolphin prison in Orenburg, conditions are considerably worse. New arrivals there are hooded, shackled, and frequently beaten on their way to their cells. Prisoners are forced to walk around with often a hood and always bent over. At White Swan Prison, discipline is similarly extreme. The slightest infraction brings immediate punishment. During the day, inmates aren't allowed to sit on their bunks from wake up through to bedtime. Prisoners who are transferred from one of these other prisons to Pyatak are enormously surprised by this dynamic. One went on record expressing his surprise that he hadn't yet been beaten. At Black Dolphin, he explained, "They beat you for looking at guards, for not looking at guards, for breathing too loud. Here, they just lock you up and leave you alone." But humanity does have its limits when you're serving life on Fire Island. After the 2011 renovations dramatically improved living conditions, the physical toll on inmates diminished, but the mental side still exacts its price. After 3 to 4 years in such extreme isolation, prisoners' personalities begin to degrade. They lose basic social skills and emotional control. Many develop obsessive behaviors, compulsive counting, repetitive movements, ritualistic patterns. Some inmates eventually go insane, which can lead to suicide attempts, though guards remain vigilant for this. Only one attempt has succeeded. Vasily Kuznetsov hanged himself with torn bedsheets. Since then, cells are searched daily, and all bedding has been designed to tear under even slight weight. Throughout the night, guards conduct hourly visual checks. The one thing that they do have to look forward to throughout the day is their exercise break, during which they're allowed outside, although not in the way the term might suggest. The areas they're permitted to use are essentially large outdoor cages, walled enclosures about 2 by 2 meters wide. Walls surround them on all sides, and they cannot see past them in any direction lest they get any ideas about escaping. They are technically outside, but not really. They're free to walk about in these exercise spots, although there's no equipment and barely enough room to walk more than a few steps in any direction. Still, prisoners take what's given to them. Some do push-ups or jumping jacks in attempts to maintain physical fitness. Others simply stand and breathe, savoring these moments as the highlight of their day. Family visitation is another aspect that may surprise visitors about this place. It's allowed for all inmates except those who cause problems inside the prison. During an inmate's first 10 years, they're allowed a 3-day visit with family in the jail's guest house once per year, which is surprisingly well furnished. It's essentially a mini apartment located within the prison walls. There are even small kitchens where relatives can cook meals and maintain some semblance of normal family interaction, even if only for a weekend. After a decade of good behavior, inmates may earn twice-yearly visits. This policy is comparatively generous compared to other countries, especially given the crimes that these men have been convicted of. This assumes, however, that the lifers still have family members who are willing to visit. Even with these comparatively generous visitation schedules, relationships inevitably crumble under the weight of permanent separation. Wives divorce, sometimes even at the instruction of the husband, who knows that continuing the marriage would be torture. Children grow up not knowing their father, occasionally making visits, but with dwindling frequencies over the years. Parents, usually the most loyal visitors, grow old and eventually die. Now, this may be a difficult concept to grasp for those experiencing burnout from their job, especially if it's a job they don't particularly enjoy, but that represents the opposite extreme of what inmates here experience. They just have total meaninglessness. The days blend together and they begin to lose track of time because they simply have nothing to do with themselves. In a place such as this, work becomes an escape from the mundane. When you have 24 hours a day to fill, 8 hours a day in a workshop can feel like salvation. Keep in mind that if an inmate doesn't have a job, they essentially have nothing to occupy themselves with all day. And we're not being hyperbolic here, trying to justify use of prison labor. Getting a position in the prison's workshop is not something anyone is forced into. Quite the opposite, actually. It's considered a reward for those who've demonstrated good behavior, and losing this privilege serves as a form of punishment for those who break the rules. Those who make it into one of these positions seldom risk losing it, knowing the mind-numbing boredom that they will return to. The workshop operates in 2 shifts, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, extending into evening. Inside, rows of industrial sewing machines hum as the inmates get to work stitching prison uniforms, work gloves, coats, even mattresses. They can earn up to 20,000 rubles a month, or roughly $250. The prison store sells items at significantly below market rates. A chocolate bar costs about 50 rubles, which is less than $1, making this something that can quite literally pay off for them. Beyond the workshop, some inmates perform essential facility maintenance tasks. Getting selected for these positions requires years of perfect behavior and demonstrating trustworthiness to the guards. These positions can also be easily revoked, even for just suspected wrongdoing. These prisoners wake up before dawn to prepare meals for the entire prison, perform cleaning duties, and even maintain the heating and electrical systems to some extent. This also means spending more time outside their cells. This maintenance work represents a different sort of privilege within the prison's ecosystem, highlighting just how unique this place is. In many prisons, the hierarchies revolve around strength, groups, numbers, and power. Here, none of this exists. It's about work, trustworthiness, and loyalty to the guards. Even though this work isn't necessarily the most meaningful and the pay isn't anything to write home about, it gives inmates something to do. It provides them with an escape from the monotony of their cells. Especially for those who cook and maintain the facility, the work offers tangible results that they can see. For those facing eternity behind bars, even these small dignities matter enormously. Now, with each passing year, more of Pyatak's lifers are reaching the 25-year mark for parole eligibility. Courts have remained steadfast in denying petitions thus far, but whether this pattern will continue is something only time will tell. Whether or not these men deserve release, that's something we'll leave to the Russian courts. But what Pyatak reveals about human nature speaks to something profound in itself. The prison's dark history of torture and murder during the Stalinist era tells one story, while its evolution towards something resembling humanity tells another. Yet even this reformed Pyatak's treatment of its inmates reveals something fundamental about human nature. We are creatures who need purpose, interaction, and meaning. When you strip those away, the mind begins to deteriorate, regardless of physical condition. The transformation from monastery to gulag to modern prison is more than just an evolution of one institution. More broadly, it can be seen as representative of our struggle with rights, punishment, and religion all in one place. Monks once sought meaning through voluntary isolation and contemplative prayer. Political prisoners were later broken through deliberate cruelty and deprivation. Today, lifers fulfill a different, third way, neither tortured nor fulfilled. They have been warehoused to death. And that really is Pyatak's most chilling characteristic. It doesn't break men through torture anymore. Time does that work perfectly well. Thank you for watching.